Welcome to another module of Collection Management, Ready to Weed, a State of Iowa Director course for the State Library Endorsement Program. My name is Becky Heil, and I'm the Southeast District Consultant and a member of the Continuing Education team for the State Library. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about why weeding is so necessary and identify some criteria that you can use for weeding your collection. I really like these quotes. It shows that weeding is an age-old problem. These are quotes from the Crew Manual, which we're going to talk about a little later. Are there any of these that resonate with you? Take a look at this first one, 1901. And I think the second one helps us remember that we are going to make mistakes in this. And I think this quote from Will Manley is my favorite. Weeding is something most librarians absolutely dread. And Anne is a consultant with a state library in Texas. So why do we need to weed? Let's talk first about why we don't weed. I mentioned that a lot of librarians really hate to do it. Some of these reasons might be the reasons that you don't like to weed, but some may be reasons that you hear from your patrons. We all love books, and it feels wrong to throw one out. That's usually the very first one. It's sacrilege. Another one is, if you bought the book, does that mean you made a mistake if you have to weed it then? The old idea of somebody may want it someday comes up over and over again when I talk with librarians. But there was actually a study that was done at Yale, and it showed that only 3% of the items that you weed are actually asked for after weeding. That's a pretty good chance of not needing that book later. I don't know how to weed. That's what we're hoping to take care of with this. I don't have time. We're going to talk about why that one really needs to get out of your vocabulary. Something is better than nothing, we're going to talk about a little later as well. And the fact that somebody says, oh, it's a very old book, so it might be worth something, is really fallacy. Even if the copyright is before 1900, which means it's over 120 years old at this point, the chances are 1 in several thousand that it's worth anything more than $5. Next, we're going to talk about why we should weed. Relevance is one of the main reasons we like to try and weed. We want to get rid of things that are inaccurate, biased, sexist, or racist. You have to be careful when you think about inaccuracy. You don't read every book that you purchase for your library, so you have to trust publishers and authors and review sources to make sure that they're not inaccurate. This example that I have here is certainly a classic one about sexist. It says, if you can't read, boys are doctors, girls are nurses. Boys are policemen, girls are meter maids. Now, this is a blatant example from 30 years ago. It was actually in a library that I worked in from 30 years ago. But there are lots of books in our collections that are old. And there are many newer titles that may be racist or have some other type of bias. Do you have lots of titles about Michael Jordan in your collection? He was popular when I was buying children's books in the 1980s. You may think he's the greatest basketball player of all time, but today, kids don't want to read about Michael Jordan. They want Steph Curry or LeBron James. They don't want to read about Madonna. They want Ariana Grande. They don't even know who Madonna is. We also have to remember that history doesn't change. That's an argument we hear a lot. You can't get rid of things that are historical because history doesn't change. But we need to remember our interpretation of history does. Now, this picture might be a little dramatic, but nobody likes to check out a book with a sticky cover. Recovering is one really easy way to refresh a book. Hopefully, your patrons' hands don't look like this after using your collection. Do yours look like this after you've been doing weeding or reshelving? Customers don't want to be overwhelmed with choices. That's one reason why they like the new book section. It's small enough so they can look over the entire collection. Bookmobiles are really popular partially because of this. Most users really like having a small selection to choose from. One quote from the Crew Manual that I really like is, "A good library is not necessarily a big library." Having a lot of books that people don't want isn't the answer to the demand for more books. One thing that drives me nuts is when a library director asks me how to get people to check out more books. Then I find out that their entire collection is made up of donations that were given to them when citizens cleaned out their basements. They may have been popular 5 years ago, but anyone who wanted to read that book did so when it first came out. Public libraries need to be adding titles to their collection that the community wants to read, not just what someone else is trying to get rid of. This goes along with the previous reason. When all the books are jammed on the shelf, it makes it really hard to find anything. We all know that libraries have changed a lot in the last decade. We need space for other things like computers, additional seating, and room for programs. And even though we want to be, we simply cannot be all things for all people. No one, not even the largest library, can provide everything that our customers want. Although, wouldn't it be nice to live in the picture on the right? Patrons and staff waste a lot of time if they have to plow through tons of junk material to find what they want. Some patrons just want to get in, get their stuff, and get out. We need to help with that by having a weeded collection. And don't forget, square footage is expensive. If you have too much junk, you think you need more space than you really should. A better collection equals more circulation. When you weed, you may notice you need more copies of things that check out a lot. You may also notice holes in your collection. And as you're looking at the circulation patterns, hopefully you can make better choices for the future. You get that immediate feedback of what it is that people are looking for. The last reason, why should we weed? The state says so. In our public library standards book, we require every library to weed a minimum of 3% of their collection every year. This can be averaged over 3 years, but just know that we believe it's important enough that we really want you to do it every year. So, what do we hope to accomplish by weeding? What are our goals? We want a better collection. That means removing items that are dated or inaccurate. It might mean relocating materials that are most useful for the public. It helps improve the access to our collection. It can also help us retain items that are of historical significance, and it gives you good data for future collection development. So where do we start? My best advice is just do it. We haven't talked a lot about policy yet, but this is really important. You can always use that to back up your decisions, just like when you're purchasing. Writing a good collection development policy makes sure to include weeding, and don't accept a gift that you wouldn't buy. Weeding can be one of the most controversial aspects of collection development, and a carefully prepared and fully documented policy on weeding can lessen or alleviate some misunderstandings. A weeding policy can't replace individual judgment or common sense, but it will make your actions more understandable to the public. If you haven't already spent some time evaluating your collection and your community while writing your collection development policy, it's certainly a good idea to do so before beginning a weeding project. Knowing what is wanted and needed by your customers makes it easier to decide what should or should not remain in the collection. A community needs assessment or a collection development section can give you suggestions for conducting that type of evaluation. Something is not better than nothing. And that's something that also comes out of the Crew Manual. Things that are outdated, wrong, or poorly presented is not better than just empty space. An example of this might be a travel book from 2005. Is there any useful information left in there? Attractions may have closed or have different hours or may have even moved. Restaurants and hotels may have changed dramatically, so the reviews may be completely off base. And think about the advances in medicine. One of the best quotes from the Crew Manual is this one: "Libraries aren't in the business of accumulating physical objects." Remember, we're trying to get our patrons to take them out of the library. It's not just to keep them in our building. So what do we weed? Poor appearance is an easy one. It could be a really fast way to get the easiest ones done first. Anybody can do this part. Just take them off the shelf. Then you can have someone go through to decide. Maybe we need to buy another copy if the pages are falling out. Maybe we need to buy a replacement title, or maybe it just needs to be tossed. If you have pages that are torn, or it looks shabby, or it's small print, or the pictures are really bad, nobody's going to want to check it out anyway. That's a really fast and easy way to pull things from your collection. Poor content is a little trickier. Again, you can't read everything. So how do you know if it's poor content then? Certainly things that are obsolete can usually be checked pretty quickly, or if it's outdated or a superseded edition. Things that are self-published tend to have a really short lifetime. And small press materials that aren't circulating, and of course we're back to biased, racist, or sexist materials. Again, what to weed? Things that aren't being used. This is a little bit easier. Duplicates are rarely needed after a couple of years. And who really needs a book about Hannah Montana from 2009 anymore? That goes back to that idea of hot topics that are over 5 years old. It's time to pitch. And by getting rid of an entire collection, formats that aren't popular anymore, think about videotapes, you only make the decision once. You don't have to make it item by item. You get rid of the entire collection. You have lots of freed up space then. Another way to get lots of space is get rid of an entire author or series that isn't popular anymore. These things to consider are just one more way to say the same things that we've just been talking about. The same ideas, just a different list. I'd like to specifically point out the last item on here, other books on the same subject in the collection. If this book is discarded, what else is available? Think about a book on headaches. It might be an okay book. It might not be terribly out of date. But if you already have 3 other newer books on headaches, toss that oldest one. The Crew Manual is something I recommend to every new library director. It stands for Continuous Review, Evaluation, and Weeding. It was put together by the State Library of Texas, and it's actually been around for a number of years and has been updated several times. These guidelines are not intended to act as a substitute for professional judgment and common sense, but they do give you a really good place to start. The great thing is this is now free. You can download your own copy online. One of their primary ways to think about weeding is through the MUSTY acronym. Think about these in order. M, misleading or factually inaccurate. Think about things like a book about how the earth is flat. That's a fairly obvious one. There may be others that have misleading information in them. We've already really talked about. Think about things like ripped pages or no cover. S, superseded. When you buy that new travel guide to Hawaii, toss the old one. T for trivial. I always chuckle over this one. We like ephemeral stuff. It's what keeps people coming back to the public library. But again, you need to get rid of it once its time is over. I, irrelevant. If you live in Ottumwa, you probably aren't reading about how to buy an ocean-going yacht. E, this is the beauty of interlibrary loan. Just because you once had someone who wanted you to buy every book there was on parrots doesn't mean you need to keep them all. You probably shouldn't have bought them all to begin with. And remember, there are other larger libraries who have more of those items that you can borrow. So the Crew Manual breaks down weeding into 10 steps. The first, we've already talked about, make weeding a part of your policy. When you write the collection development policy, it's imperative that weeding becomes a part of that. Number two, you're going to want to look for circulation statistics reports. Back in the old days when we used checkout cards, it was a simple matter to open it up and look at the date dues and find out when the last time that book was checked out, or how many times it went out in the last 3 years. Now it's an easy task to pull those statistics reports out of our circulation systems and have that piece of paper in your hand as you're looking at all of those books. It will tell you things like when was the last time this was checked out, or how many times did it go out in 3 years. Another really great tip is build weeding into your year's work calendar. Sometimes we put it off for so long that at the end of that 3-year period when we have to do it, it can seem to be an overwhelming task. If you build it into the calendar, so in January, maybe you weed the zeros, the 100s, and the 200s. And then in February, you tackle the 300s because there's a lot more of those, and there's a lot more to weed generally because of the social sciences. Maybe you break your fiction collection up into 3 different categories, or maybe you do all of the picture books at one time. So make sure that you plan every month to do some type of weeding in one section of your collection. Next is get ready. Gather those circ statistics, gather some sticky notes, your pen, your crew manual, a book cart, and what they call disposal slips. The disposal slips are things that you can find at the end of the crew manual, and it may be a little more in depth than you actually want to be, but what it helps you do is think about the options for that book when you pull it off the shelf. Maybe it needs to be rebound, or maybe it needs to be mended or preserved somehow. Maybe this is a book that just got buried. It was down on the bottom shelf, but you know it would go out if more people saw it. So maybe it needs to be promoted or put into a display. Maybe this is one that you know another library or a school or someone else could use. Check it to make sure it's not in other locations. If you've got it somewhere else in the library, you can get rid of one of those copies. Does it just need to be discarded or thrown out? Should it go to a book sale? Or does it need to be replaced? So if you've got those disposal slips, you can just make a check for which one of these, for each book, and tell it which one it needs to have happen. Again, that might be a little bit more formal that you need, but I'd like you to at least think about all those ideas as you look at every book. You also want to step back and study that whole area. Maybe use the Post-it notes or the disposal slips. Take a look and see what is it that is missing maybe here. The age-old question is, should you do an inventory at the same time as you do a large weeding project? There are arguments both for and against on this one. So think about the possibilities for this and make a decision for your local library. Another thing that's really important is to check those pulled books against lists. The State Library currently provides the Wilson Core collections for everyone. This is a list of items that every library should have in their collection. So take a look at those lists and make sure you're not pulling something that really would be recommended. We don't know everything about every genre. We don't know all of the best books about fishing. So to look at a list of here's the best books about fishing can help you make that decision if this is one you can get rid of or not. Then once you've pulled those books, the recommendation is to treat it according to however you mark that disposal slip. Maybe you want to promote this title. Maybe you want to donate it. Maybe you want to just discard it or put it in the book sale. Again, you may not have actually made a piece of paper for every single book, but you might have piles of things that you want to promote at some point. Then the last two items, if you did discover that you need to replace something because it's worn out and you know you need a new copy, or this book on headaches is the only one you have and it's getting a little old, you need to go through and order some of the new ones. And then, of course, if you decided you wanted to promote some of those items, think about the displays that you might want to do. So this is the tough part. How or where do we get rid of all these books? 3% of your collection can add up to quite a pile of books. So what are your options? What can you do with books that your library no longer wants or needs? Donate. Now, this is a tricky one. Because of Iowa law, you may not donate items to Goodwill or the Boy Scouts or even a daycare. You may not donate to any private entity. You may, under the law, donate items to another government agency, such as a public school, a jail, or a Head Start. The law is a little murkier when it comes to donating materials to friends of the library. It's best to sell them to the friends, even if it's only for a small amount. You could sell them the entire collection for $3 if that's what it takes. Then the friends can sell them and use that money to support the library. Also, be careful if you're considering giving them away to another library. Although legally that's okay, as long as it's a public library, but you do need to consider if they were old and outdated and unusable for your patrons, why would anybody else want them? It goes back to what we said earlier. Something is not better than nothing, and that outdated, wrong, or poorly presented information is not better than empty space. Sell. The library can still sell them out of the library building and put the money back into the budget with a budget amendment. Using consignment companies can also be considered selling items. There used to be many more options for this. However, several of the most known ones have made it more difficult to sell by consignment. Recycle. This can mean recycling by tearing off the covers and taking to the city or county recycling center, or it might mean using them for recycled projects. Altered books are really fun. The last one is destroy them. Although this is your last resort, it's okay, really. I know it's hard, but usually there's a reason a book hasn't circulated in 5 or 10 years. This, I believe, is a picture of a book sale that was held in a large library. And there's our ideas for recycling. And here's a really creative way to use those books into recycled art projects. And finally, the dumpster is sometimes the only way. So when you're getting rid of materials, I have some do's and don'ts. First, sit down with your staff and your trustees and explain the process. It's going to be difficult enough to convince the patrons that throwing away books is okay. You don't want to have your staff or trustees actively working against you. Make sure they understand all those reasons of why it's important to have a weeded collection. Another idea is to save examples of the most blatant examples of materials that shouldn't be in the collection. So that picture of boys are policemen and girls are meter maids, if you weeded that from your collection, the next time that patron comes in and says, "Why are you throwing away books?" you can show them that one and say, "These are the things that we're throwing away." And again, make weeding an ongoing process. Part of the problem that we see with patrons or interested citizens is they see an entire dumpster full of books, and that really sets them off. If you're throwing away things a few at a time, it doesn't become such a big problem. And another thing you absolutely need to do is check with your city or county on any policy they might have on what to do with items that are paid for with tax dollars. There was a city several years ago that had a policy that said a department may not get rid or throw away anything out of their building. That makes sense for the guys cutting the lawn and the lawnmower goes. You want to have a way to dispose of that or sell it or get it fixed, but it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for libraries. We have to get rid of those materials. So make sure that you have checked your city or county policies before starting a weeding project. So don't make your weeded books a problem for someone else. Just because the library down the road doesn't have as big of a collection as you do, doesn't mean that you need to give them all of your old items. Don't pile those books up someplace in the library just for somebody to trip over. We tend to not have a whole lot of space, and when you put them in all those piles, it can be a real hazard. Don't keep hundreds in your attic or your basement just in case somebody objects. And don't take hundreds to the landfill, as we talked about on the last slide. This concludes the Ready to Weed module of the Director Endorsement course, Collection Management. Don't forget you can always call your district consultant for more information about this topic, and we will also have more courses available specifically on weeding. Thanks for watching.